Who's very woke is our next presenter, the legendary, one-of-a-kind, one of my heroes, G. Edward Griffin.
The reason we're here, it's been said so eloquently by our previous speaker and by Benny also, and also in conversation that I've had with people here, we're all here because we're aware and disgusted with the fact that tyranny is on the rise. It's on the rise everywhere in the world. It's particularly on the rise in our world. And we want to do something about it. Tyranny is on the rise. And we know that from our personal experience, those of us that like to read history books, from the historical experience as well, there's a close association between tyranny and this thing called government. So there's a tendency to think that tyranny and government are the same thing. As you have one, you have the other. Why do we think that? Is because it's always been the way. Look at history. Every time we've had government, we found that eventually, no matter how well-intentioned it was to be in the beginning, how well-intentioned the founders of that government were, and no matter what great start they made, with the passage of time, all governments, including the best of them, gradually evolved into crime syndicates, or worse. So, since this is the history, it's logical for people to say, well, that means that that's the nature of government, isn't it? Because they all gradually become crime syndicates, organized criminal syndicates. So therefore, end of discussion. The solution to tyranny is to get rid of government. Now that takes us to the word anarchy. What does anarchy mean? Well, you can read a lot of essays on it, but generally you go to the dictionary and it all boils down to one thing, which is the absence of government. I think everybody here would agree on that, although we may disagree on other aspects of it. That's the essence of anarchy, is no government. And the reason that's a very appealing thought is because we know that governments, that word, government, is associated inexorably with the development of tyranny. So, with that, I'd like to introduce a question to you, which I already have. When is the government not a government? In other words, what that means is it necessary, is it necessarily true that the two words are interchangeable, that they are synonyms of each other? Or is it possible that there is something other than no government, which is still something other than anarchy, which is the absence of government? Well, that's kind of circular thinking because we haven't yet really defined what government is. I'd like to propose a theory for your consideration today. I've written it out because it's a tough theory to state, and I want to be very precise with it, and I got it down to 92 words. It's not bad considering the nature of this topic. So I'm going to read this to you. And this is my theory about this question that I have raised. And here it is. All governments in the world and throughout history, no matter how well they began, gradually evolved into crime syndicates and imposed tyranny on their subjects. Despite this unbroken record, governments are not the cause of tyranny, but merely a mechanism by which tyranny is administered. The elimination of government, without replacing it with a superior form of organized mutual defense, actually would intensify the existing tyranny. Although such a structure has not yet been created, it is now possible to do so based on the lessons learned from millennia of human experience. So that's my theory, and I'd like to take the rest of my time here to offer support for why I think this is a valid theory. It's something that admittedly has never been done before. So that's a strong argument against it. Maybe the reason it's never been done is because it cannot be done. Or another reason it's never been done is because it's never been tried. And I believe it's the latter and not the former. I'd like to begin with a very powerful argument against government. It's an argument with which everybody in this room is familiar. I don't know if you've ever heard it spoken in the words of its founder. The founder of anarchism is Joseph Proudhon. That's how it's pronounced. I had to look it up in the dictionary to get the precise definition of or sound. Is Proudhon. And here's what he wrote. I dug it out, and here's what he wrote. He's actually he's the creator of the word anarchism. He's the first person that we know of to call himself an anarchist. And here's how he said it. To be governed is to be watched over, inspected, spied on, directed, legislated at, regulated, docketed, indoctrinated, preached at, controlled, assessed, weighed, censored, ordered about by men who have neither the right nor the knowledge nor the virtue. To be governed is to be at every operation, at every transaction, noted, registered, enrolled, taxed, stamped, measured, numbered, assessed, licensed, authorized, admonished, forbidden, reformed, corrected, punished, trained, ransomed, exploited, monopolized, extorted, squeezed, mystified, robbed. Then at the slightest resistance, the first word of complaint, to be repressed, fined, despised, harassed, tracked, abused, clubbed, dispersed, disarmed, choked, imprisoned, judged, condemned, shot, deported, sacrificed, sold, betrayed, and to crown all, mocked, ridiculed, outraged, dishonored. That is government, says Joseph Proudhon. Well, not many will disagree with that, especially those in this room, obviously. And I think even those who just are bristle, I should say, against the word bristling and bristling. But if you bristle against this, still you know instinctively it's pretty true. So now let's take a look at this a little deeper at this topic. What is this thing, government? And this concept of people coming together and forming some kind of a instinctive association that we now describe as government, most of us. And I found the most interesting and enlightening explanation of that it was in a book called The Territorial Imperative, a personal inquiry into the animal origins of property. I urge all of you to get hold of that book and read it, if you will. It's written by Robert Ardrey, and it is written from the perspective of an anthropologist. And he's one of those guys that spends most of his life sitting in duck lines or some kind of concealments out in the wilderness, and he'll sit there all week or all month, in some cases all year, with a little notebook and a camera, and noticing what the animals are doing and trying to figure out what their patterns of behavior are. And he's one of those guys. And so he wrote this book, and it was amazing to find out how much of the human impulses that we have can be found in very obvious parallel forms in lower forms of life, particularly the mammal kingdom. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. One example in particular I thought you might find funny, but they all add up to the one thing, and that is that human behavior, whether we like it or not, really is instinctive. And the reason we know that or can assume that is because we find the same human-like behavior in so many other species, not just the mammals, but birds and reptiles and lower forms, but certainly very powerfully in all mammals. And the one example I'd like to tell you about, because it made me laugh out loud reading the book, what was this animal he was studying? Oh gosh, I didn't write it down. Well, anyway, it's a form of deer, I guess I didn't write it down. Anyway, it's a form of small deer, and it's found in some little country in Africa. And I'm just going to call it the DARP, okay? It's something like that. And they're little deer, and every year at mating season, of course, this is not unusual, it happens in a lot of other animal kingdoms too, but all the animals come to what they call, or what we call, a mating ground. It's always the same mating ground. In this case, it was a very large clearing in the middle of the forest. And there were little mounds all throughout this meadow-like. And the mounds apparently had been created by the animals themselves, probably kicking up the soil and maybe leaving excrement on it and so forth. But there were these definite mounds that were all over this huge meadow, and the mounds were more green than the grass around them. For some reason, these mounds were very, very significant. And so the animals come at a certain time, and immediately the males go out and they pick a mound that it's going to be their mound, it's their property. And there's some writing that goes on over that, who gets what mound, and apparently some mounds are more desirable than other mounds, because there's more fighting going on over those mounds. And this is common. We've seen this in a lot of different animal species. And meanwhile, the females are all back in the woods, watching and say, "Come on, guys, hurry up, get this over with." And so the guys are fighting over the mounds, and usually the older animals, the older males, still can protect their mounds. Sometimes they're challenged by the younger ones, and occasionally there's an older one that gets pushed off, and you know how that works. But then finally, after this goes on for a day or two, finally it's time for the mating, and then the females come into the walking among the mounds, and the males are standing there looking cool. That's all they're doing, just standing there. And the females are picking the mound. Not the male, but the mound. And we know this because there are certain mounds that attract more females every season, even though the mound may be occupied by a different male that season. So we know something about the mound. And anyway, this is how it works, and some of the mounds always wind up with several females actually on the mound, and some of the others, poor chaps, only have one female on the mound, but that's how it works. And so the reason I'm telling you this, because of Audrey's comment after observing all the details of this procedure, this ritual. He says it looks like the females are not too fussy about with whom they mate, so long as it's at a good address. I had to laugh out loud. And I just take that because the whole bloody book is loaded with little insights to human apparently instinctive behavior that certainly comes from something more than just the culture around us. And so it's an instinct, and we know that there are other things involved with forming into groups to protect certain territories because of protection against enemies. Okay, that's commonly known. But it's the defense of property and the desire to have property is tied very closely to the mating instinct for some reason. And we find that especially in the bird kingdom as well. You take away the possibility for a lot of animal species to have what we would call private property, their own domains, they don't mate. It's somehow tied in with having a place of your own, a place to raise your family, and that kind of thing. It's instinctive. So I mention this only because I came across this primarily because I was primarily interested in the instinctive roots of private property, but that doesn't apply here to our conversation. But I do just mention that Ardres came to the conclusion that you can take the human and try and educate him against an instinct for private property, or to form into groups for mutual defense or for mating or whatever reason. But once you do that, you've taken something very deep and instinctive out of the animal, out of the species, and they do not thrive very well. So my only purpose in mentioning that here in this context is that animals of all species do form instinctively into groups for their mutual defense and for other social reasons as well, which you find in some of the bamboo tribes. There's very social output of the association into groups. But the point is that no matter whether we call it government or not, and of course in this case we don't call it government, groups do come together voluntarily for their own mutual defense and mutual benefit other than just defense, whether we like it or not. But so that's how it worked for millennia, just a voluntary association of animals, and I'm sure the humans proceeded along the same lines of evolution as I shouldn't say evolution, just development, as others. And it's apparently worked okay without anything that we would call government. for thousands of years. And then finally human nature succumbed to what I call the Cosa Nostra syndrome. Now that is really interesting. If you've never studied the evolution of Cosa Nostra, what we now call the mafia in the United States, it has a definitely well documented history. There are several books on the topic, but the bottom line of all of that is that for about 2,000 years in Sicily, which is southern Italy, there were what we call nation states, and they were not governments. There were no governments. They were just little local groupings of people, sort of an extended tribe, you might call it, but there were nothing like real governments. And so for 2,000 years, that part of the world endured a whole sequence of foreign conquerors, feudal overlords, roving bandits, and so forth. And it was necessary for those who had acquired any kind of property and any land to hire guards, to hire gunslingers. These were usually sort of criminals themselves who had a reputation for being pretty good for fighting. And but they would hire them to protect their lands, like a private security force. This is the beginning of the hiring of a private security force, at least in Italy. And they called them, that evolved over a couple of hundred years, they called themselves the men of honor. You'll find that phrase used. It was like a profession. We are the professional gunslingers. We are the professional warriors. We will defend your property for a price. So we're not government, but we're going to a security firm. You hire us, and we will protect your property, and you don't have to worry about government anymore. Well, we all know what happens, and I'll condense that. Over about 3 generations or 4 generations, the men of honor became the new landholders, because the old landholders usually got pushed off the land or killed. So the defenders or the protectors became the new rulers. They rose to the top. They were the new landholders. They betrayed, generationally, they betrayed their employers. And we see from that experience that you can find it elsewhere around the world, but it's so clear because of the books that have been written about the rise of Nostra. You can see that just having a private security firm is not the answer. It is just as vulnerable to becoming a tyranny as though we call it government. It's not a question of government. It's a question of the delegation of authority to a small group of people to use what we would now call legalized force in the defense of our property. So that's not in itself the answer. The lesson I came away from that is that we cannot avoid, no way to avoid the need for delegated protection to a group of professional security people. But we cannot trust them, no matter whether we call them government agents or whether we call them employees. That's not important, the words that we use to describe them. What is important is that they are now dangerous, and we cannot turn our back on them. We better be very concerned with developing ways, which so far has not yet been done, of monitoring their behavior and protecting them, or protecting ourselves against the development of tyranny in their hands. Now, you may be surprised here at this group that our friend Joseph Proudhon actually agreed with that. I was surprised when I came across it, and here's what he said. He said, "I build no system. I ask an end to privilege and an abolition of slavery, equality of rights, and the reign of law. Justice, nothing else. That is the alpha and omega of my argument. To others I leave the business of governing the world." So even the father of anarchism calls for the reign of law. Isn't that interesting? How can you have the reign of law without a government to pass laws? Well, now we're getting to some of these nuances of these words. This is where it really gets interesting. So, the American founding fathers also agreed with that. You might remember some of these quotes, better known. Speaking of liberty, Patrick Henry said, "Suspect everyone who approaches that jewel, liberty. Unfortunately, nothing will preserve it but downright force." Downright force will That's all you can have to protect your liberty. If you cannot defend your liberty, you won't keep it, because those who have the power, the force to take it from you certainly will do so. And that's why the Constitution of the United States calls for a militia. I don't know how many of you have really gotten into that part of it, but the Constitution is right there. It's still there today. It calls for a militia to be formed, not by this federal government, but by the local states, the local units, as close to the community as possible. Local military units to defend the jewel, as Patrick Henry called it, to defend the jewel of liberty. Well, to defend it against what? What are you defending it against? In those days, as you all know, the primary suspect was the federal government itself, not against local criminals, but against governments. Okay, if anarchy means no government, then Proudhon's vision of anarchy with laws seems contradictory, doesn't it? But that's true only, I believe, if we assume that governments are capable of protecting us, and only governments are capable of protecting us. And I think that is a false assumption. So we come to the question, well, if not governments, then what? Private companies? Well, we just covered that. That's the Cosa Nostra syndrome. No, private companies. I mean, if you think a private company is good, just go hire Blackwater and see how well that turns out. No, that's not it. What's the solution? If you were writing the Constitution for a new system, knowing that politicians can't be trusted, and knowing also that neither can private institutions, then would you create a government? Now we finally come to a definition of what that word means. What is a government? We all know it instinctively. It means to govern. The dictionary even agrees with that. The dictionary says it defines government as to rule or control. Does anybody here want to be ruled or controlled? Do you want to be governed? No, not many people do. So then what do you want? What do we want when we form into these voluntary associations like animals and other species? What do we do that for? We want to be not governed, but protected. That's our only motivation. We want protection. Protection. Well, what are we protecting it? We want something, some organized force, which we create and approve and delegate and control ourselves to defend our lives, our liberty, and our property, and that's where it stops. Why does it stop there? Well, it stops there for a good reason, just because that's where we want it to stop, but it's also for another reason, which is that's the only basis for us to delegate authority to it in the first place. When we are delegating authority to, whether we call it government, or whether we call it a security firm, or whether we call it an association, or whether we just call it our good old boys, I don't care what we call it, the words don't make any difference. When we delegate the legalized or the accepted use of force on our defense, we mean force. We mean even lethal force if necessary. That means we have to have that right ourselves before we can delegate it to someone else. What do we have the right to kill for? Do we have the right? Well, I think we do. But if somebody's trying to kill us, we have to defend ourselves, our lives. We have a right to do it. We don't like to do it. Nobody likes to hear about that. But if you have to defend your life, nobody would condemn you for taking the life of your assailant. Or very few would. Hardly any. Some might run into. It's amazing, but they do. So we have the right to use coercive force to defend our lives, so we can delegate that. Do we have the right to use coercive force to develop our liberty? Yes. If somebody wants to enslave me, that's taken my life from me, really. Makes me serve them. It's not me anymore. They've taken my life. They've taken control of my whole existence. I have a right, and so do you, to use coercive force to defend your liberty. Then we come to this thing, property. Well, that's another topic, but I think if you follow that all the way through, you'll see that property is necessary for the defense of life and liberty. You cannot defend your life or your liberty unless you own tools, including weapons, unless you've got food that grows on your land so you can eat, unless you have access to your own water. You have to survive. And that means you have to have property that you own and control. If somebody else controls the source of your food and the tools you have, and so then you cannot defend your life and liberty. You have to depend on them to do it. And so property is indirectly on that list. Life, liberty, and property. But that's where it ends. I defy anybody to tell me that they have a right to use coercive force against some other human being to close their shop on Sunday, or whatever, to teach their kids certain things in schools, or to talk in a certain way, or to think a certain way, or whatever. No, it's not possible for you or I to use coercive force against our friends and neighbors to do anything except to defend our lives, liberty, and property. So therefore, when we create this thing that is non-government, but which we must create for our mutual defense, we give it the right to use coercive force in the defense of life, liberty, or property, and nothing more. And that's where we draw the line. This is the thing that's never been done before in history. See, there's the key. This issue has been grappled with many times in history, but no one has ever got the idea that, well, yes on some things and no on other things. They've always gotten the idea that, well, it's either yes or no across the board. And that's where and why it's failed. We now can see in retrospect that that was a fatal flaw. There are some things that, yes, you must delegate force for, the right to use force, but most things, no. This isn't something so difficult to comprehend. Why hasn't it been tried? I don't know, but it's time now to give it a try. So, getting back to my outline here, if employees or elected representatives of this thing we create, let's just call it a nation or community, if those people could be prohibited from governing us, then this thing we created could not be called a government. Couldn't be called a government, because that's not what it's allowed to do. So what would we call it? It has no name. It's time for us to give it a name. And I suggest we call it a protectorate. There's the word. Wouldn't it be wonderful if, when we went to school, and the teacher says, well, what is the best kind of government to have? And they'd salt the answer right by using the word government. In other words, what kind of a system, they say, is it best to allow other people to govern you? And we lose the argument right there. We don't even have any options for anything else. That's part of the problem. What if they said, okay, students, what is the best kind of a protectorate to have? And with the use of that word, right away we've shifted the whole emphasis and put the spotlight on the essence of this thing. It's to protect and not to govern. And so that is what I'd like to contribute to the process of discussion on this issue. I think we need to put the word protectorate into the language, in a sense, different than the way it is already there. Right now, if we have one nation has a protectorate of another nation, which means they agree to provide the military and police support for it, but meanwhile it still is owned by them in the first place. That's not what I'm talking about. So we're adding the word protectorate to the vocabulary, hopefully, but with that very definite meaning that this means that the function of the state, let's call it the state, is limited to being defensive only, to the defense of life, liberty, and property, and nothing more. Now I'd like to take this one step forward and give you my definition in more precise language of what a protectorate could be. This is not complete by a long shot, but here are some of the elements that I see that might be important. A protectorate is a voluntary association of men and women living in a defined geographical area who do not want to be ruled or governed but who voluntarily join together for mutual defense of their lives, liberty, and property, nothing more. For that purpose, and that purpose alone, they agree to accept funding assessments determined by a committee of their peers who are selected at random. By that I mean like you're selected for a jury duty. I mean, it's taken from a list. Who are selected at random and who serve without pay for a limited term. There are no elections and no benefits of service to attract power seekers. That's my definition of a protectorate. I'd like to kind of approach the conclusion of this by saying that a protectorate in my mind would be based on the principles expressed in the Freedom Force Creed of Freedom. I don't know, how many of you here are familiar with that? Have you read that? If you, oh, well, good. This is only one or two people. That means we got recruits here. That's good. I want you to read the Creed of Freedom, which is my best shot as a sort of a template for what the ideal protectorate would look like. And you'll find it on the internet and the website of freedomforceinternational.org. I want you to read it, not because you will need to read it, because I'm going to read it for you here in a minute, but this will open up a lot of questions. And at the bottom of that, on the internet, there will be some references, and you can go to longer essays that'll develop the rationale and the history that I believe completely supports these principles that I'm about to read. Okay? Note as I read these principles that the word government does not appear anywhere in it. Okay. 1. I believe that only individuals have rights, not the collective group. That these rights are intrinsic to each individual, not granted by the state. For if the state has the power to grant them, it also has the power to deny them, and that is incompatible with personal liberty. 2. I believe that a just state derives its power solely from its citizens. Therefore, the state must never presume to do anything beyond what individual citizens also have the right to do. Otherwise, the state is a power unto itself and becomes the master instead of the servant of society. 3. I believe that one of the greatest threats to freedom is to allow any group, no matter its numeric superiority, to deny the rights of the minority. And that one of the primary functions of a just state is to protect each individual from the greed and passion of the majority. 4. I believe that desirable social and economic objectives are better achieved by voluntary action than by coercion of law. I believe that social tranquility and brotherhood are better achieved by tolerance, persuasion, and the power of good example than by coercion of law. I believe that those in need are better served by charity, which is the giving of one's own money, than by welfare, which is the giving of other people's money through coercion of law. 5. I believe that the human instinct for private property is a positive force, because it provides an incentive for production, which is necessary for the material support of mankind. It justly rewards those who use resources wisely and punishes those who abuse them. Those without property must depend on others for survival, and those who depend on the state must serve the state. Therefore, private property is a human right, essential for prosperity, justice, and freedom. 6. I believe in freedom to accept or reject any currency or other forms of money based entirely upon my personal judgment of its value. Because a monopoly over the issuance of money and the power to force others to accept it leads to corruption, inflation, and legalized plunder. 7. I believe that all citizens should be equal under law, regardless of their national origin, race, religion, gender, education, economic status, lifestyle, or political opinion. Likewise, no class should be given preferential treatment, regardless of the merit or popularity of its cause. To favor one class over another is not equality under law. 8, I believe that leadership, I have to pause and say, think about our current leadership right now, okay? I believe that leadership is a natural outgrowth of human dynamics and is essential for social order and large-scale tasks. However, there are 2 types of leadership. One is based on coercion and decree, found in military organizations and totalitarian political systems. The other is based on persuasion and good example, found in voluntary organizations and free political systems. We must evaluate leaders not only on their stated goals, but on which type of leadership they offer. Their goals may be admirable, but how they pursue those goals may be tyranny. All modern totalitarian systems have a great leader who claims to represent the best interests of the people, but who is in reality merely a dictator. Truly great political leaders do not follow that path. 9, I believe that the proper role of the state is negative, not positive. Defensive, not aggressive. It is to protect, not to provide. For if the state is granted the power to provide for some, they must also be able to take from others. And that always leads to legalized plunder and loss of freedom. If the state is powerful enough to give us everything we want, it also will be powerful enough to take from us everything we have. Therefore, the proper function of the state is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens, nothing more. That state is best which governs least. So, ladies and gentlemen, the riddle has been answered. When is a government not a government? When it's a protectorate. Thank you.